No, there we go. Oh, now it's working. I'm just going to put it right here. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to start out with a little story. I'm Karen Larson with the State Water Board. I drank the Kool-Aid about 4 years ago on bioassessment in terms of its utility and our need for it. I guess I can move away from here, can't I? And so I am the lead staff person developing a policy. I won't call it bioobjectives because it may or may not be bioobjectives. For incorporating bioassessment tools into our regulatory framework at the water boards. Last year, I was here giving you an update along with Pete Odie and Rafi Mazor and Ken Schiff, I think, as well, talking a lot about the science behind the policy development. And basically, we're at a stage where the technical pieces have really been developed and they're ready to go, at least for the most part. I think we have a lot more work to do in terms of causal assessment, but I think that can be done once we have a policy in place. But so we're at a stage now where the policy really needs to move forward into the rulemaking process. So since last CABW, last fall, we held a science workshop in front of the State Water Resources Control Board back in January and basically focused in on the scientific foundation for the policy development effort. And what that did for us were a couple of things. Basically put us on the map in terms of the technical foundation and got the board members paying attention to what we were doing. Not only did it get the board members paying attention, but it also got our management much more engaged, including our legal staff. So at that point, we were able to really engage together with our management to talk about what are some of the options that we have for moving forward with biological assessment methods in our regulatory programs. And we met over a series of meetings to talk about, well, gosh, what do we want to do with these tools? And so I just wanted to give you a smattering of things that we decided we wanted to be able to do. So we talked about using them for targets in our total maximum daily loads, measuring recovery and setting expectations for restoration in those water quality control programs, supporting linkage analysis in nutrient TMDLs in particular, so linking nutrient concentrations with the impacts to the biology. We wanted to be able to prioritize where we put our resources and seek places where we see the restoration and recovery potential for the biology. We wanted to provide guidance for using bioassessment and physical habitat assessment and anti-degradation analyses, establish mitigation requirements and monitoring requirements, establish reasonable expectations for modified streams, and I'll put modified in big air quotes because we haven't defined what we mean exactly by modified, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We wanted to be able to identify where chemical criteria may be too stringent for protecting aquatic life. We wanted to be able to interpret narrative objectives that are already existing in the basin plans, for example, biostimulatory substances, sedimentation, those kinds of things. And we wanted to be able to support nutrient criteria development and implementation. So we talked about all of those things, what we wanted to be able to do, and the answer we got back, particularly from our legal staff, was, well, you can do all of those things now. So we're like, oh, well, then why do we need a rulemaking? And the answer was, you need a rulemaking when you want to establish any consistency on a statewide basis so that all of the regional boards are doing things consistently, using the consistent methods and consistent models and consistent ways of interpreting the data and applying it to our regulatory programs. So that's where we are today, is we still want to be able to do all those things. Now we're fleshing out some options for the regulatory pathway to get there. So I'm going to talk about the policy goals related to what I just talked about in terms of consistency and the things that we want to be able to do. I'm going to touch on the policy options we're currently exploring and then give you some next steps. So, policy goal number 1, establish consistent methods for conducting bioassessment both in the field and in the laboratory. Establish consistent methods for interpreting those data, in other words, our modeling tools, and endpoints for reasonable protection of beneficial uses. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the goal number 1 in a second. Goal number 2 is identifying where we have streams that are still in good biological condition and protecting those from degradation using our anti-degradation policy. And then the third goal is identifying streams where they're not in good condition and restoring them to either good condition or for streams where we think good or reference cannot be achieved, some best attainable condition. So in achieving goal number 1, we have decided that we want to establish some consistent methods and consistent ways of applying the tools. So we've identified perennial weightable streams as the population of streams that the policy will apply to using benthic macroinvertebrate indicators. And you've heard me say, or at least everyone that's been at the last couple of CABW meetings, you've heard me talk about the need for us to have multiple indicators for applying to multiple water bodies. We're at a stage, as you know, where we have a lot of information about macroinvertebrates and have established a good technical foundation to use those as indicators, so we're going to focus in on those now with the eye toward adding additional indicators in the future. We want to establish consistent monitoring and assessment methods, so we do have the SWAMP protocols for both field and laboratory methods all established, and I'll bet we'll just raise your hand if you've ever done and used the SWAMP protocols for field and lab. Yay, I'm sure the whole room should be raising their hand, right? And then as Pete presented at your last meeting last year, we've established the California, and I say we as the collective we, really Pete and his group did it, established the California Stream Condition Index that we're going to be using on a statewide basis to interpret the data. And we also need to define at what scale the score is representative spatially. We'll also establish biological condition endpoints, and I'm calling it that because I had to pick something to call it. So that's our current, what we're calling the threshold, what's good, what's bad. And we'll be defining the process for defining current condition for anti-degradation analyses. In terms of the biological condition endpoints, we are looking towards having a definition that we're calling sort of the standard biological condition endpoints, where we compare sites to reference. And so for this example, good condition is, and we're just still trying to figure these things out, but we're proposing a 4-sample average of greater than or equal to a CSCI score of 0.85, and then of course below that would be not good condition. So that's our standard in streams where we would expect those streams to be able to achieve reference. And then we have other streams where we wouldn't reasonably expect those streams to achieve reference. So the example that we always throw out, and I'll just do it again this time, is concrete line streams that are designed for conveying flood flows. So in those instances, and that's only one among possibly many, we want to establish a consistent method for identifying those streams and the criteria for defining that population of streams, assemble the data and evaluate the variability among similar modified streams, calculate the CSCI scores in that population of similarly modified streams, and then set a biological endpoint at some fixed quantile within each category. So that's sort of a stepwise approach that we plan to use more on a site-specific basis for establishing alternative biological endpoints for our modified streams. So both these last few slides are really to get us to consistent methods of applying the tools. So that's our goal number 1. Goal number 2 and 3 are about how do we use our thresholds and our endpoints in our regulatory programs, and what pathway are we going to use to put the policy in place? So we've got three options. The first one is one that we've probably talked about from the very beginning, which is establishing a statewide narrative objective that we would amend into the Inland Surface Waters and Enclosed Bays and Estuaries Plan. So that's a statewide water quality control plan. And the narrative would be designed for protecting biological communities. Under this option, we'd establish biological condition endpoints to protect beneficial uses, and then provide direction for the reasonable protection of beneficial uses in modified streams. Now, that last point is the point that's pretty important for this option, and I'm going to just start going down the policy wonk path here, so my apologies. This is really the dry stuff. I'll leave you to all the good stuff after I'm done talking. So the big roadblock in my mind for going with option number one is that it really constrains us in terms of what thresholds we establish. So at the statewide plan level, if we were to move forward with establishing alternative endpoints for modified streams, we would essentially be saying that, well, we've got these standard streams that we believe should be able to achieve reference, so they need to hit the 0.85. But we have these population of modified streams that maybe they need to hit a 0.4, let's just say. Well, under this state plan level approach, the assumption there is that both of those numbers are protective of beneficial uses. And so it's hard for me to even pass my own laugh test trying to say that both of those are equally protective of beneficial uses. So that's kind of a roadblock there on the statewide level. Well, okay, then you might say, why don't we change beneficial uses? And so we could provide direction to the regional boards for using the tools to conduct a use attainability analysis and establish site-specific objectives for those streams. Well, many of you may not have been involved, but I think some of you have been involved with the development of a UAA and understand that it's an expensive process and difficult and may not even be appropriate in all cases. As we show on the slide, it's not appropriate if the use has existed since 1975. And I can think of at least a few communities in the Central Valley region that have developed since 1975, and I could argue that the use, whatever use we're talking about, the bugs were in better condition back then than they are now. So this approach may require us to develop new subcategories of beneficial uses. You may think of it more like tiered aquatic life uses is a term that you may be familiar with. And so there's a lot of roadblocks that don't allow us to achieve at least our best attainable goals for some of the modified streams in this particular option. Option 2 is to amend our policy for listing a water body as impaired on our Clean Water Act 303D list. The policy already exists. It also already has provisions in it that allow us to use biological assessment and physical habitat data to identify a water body as impaired. However, it currently requires that that impairment be connected with, I think the term in the policy is actually associated with another chemical. And so, as you all know, the benefit of using bioassessment to assess our streams is that it will respond to all types of stressors and even stressors that we may or may not be measuring in that stream, or may not be measuring at the right time in that stream. And so connecting it with another chemical without doing a more robust causal assessment puts us down a path of connecting the impairment with potentially a chemical that's not a driver of the impairment. So one of the things that we would want to do in this option is to amend the policy to allow listing as impaired for biological data alone. We would want to amend the policy to also specify the methods, so getting back to our goal number 1, which is consistent methods. So there's a section in the policy that talks about how to assess certain types of data, so we would want to amend the policy to insert our methods into it. And then we would need to evaluate whether the numbers of samples that are necessary for listing that are currently in the policy, those of you who are familiar with it may know about the binomial distribution and how many samples it takes to get on the list and how many samples it takes to get off. It's a lot more to get off than get on. And so does that make sense for biological assessment data? Now the problem with this option is that it does not help us achieve policy goal number 2, which is to protect healthy streams. This policy is focused solely on impaired streams, so it would not trigger in and of itself an anti-degradation analysis for areas where streams are in good condition. Now there are ways that we could establish additional guidance outside of the policy for protecting healthy streams, and one of the things that we are doing, hopefully in the next round of 305B assessment and 303D listing, is to take a subset of our reference streams and actually establish them in category 1 of our 305B list, which is achieving all beneficial uses. So there are ways that we can start to achieve policy goal number 2, but that's one of the downsides of option 2. Now, I should have said this before I started talking about the options, but they're sort of organized from most stringent and most inflexible. So option 1 is the least flexible for the regional boards, option 2 a little bit more flexibility, and option 3 is even more flexibility. Option 3 is solely focused on the state authority that we have under the Porter-Cologne Water Quality Control Act, and it is the establishment of a statewide policy for water quality control. And what a statewide policy does is it does apply to all of the regional boards, and it provides an overarching framework of policy goals for the water boards to utilize biological assessment methods and data, but more on a case-by-case basis. So it gives the regional boards a lot more flexibility on how they want to apply the tools in their regulatory programs. It may require regional boards to amend their own basin plans to incorporate the new policy, depending on whether there are conflicts in their existing basin plans or not. And it may be questionable whether the regional boards will be able to use these data for enforcement, and that's because not all of the regional boards have a readily applicable narrative objective that they could use these tools to interpret in an enforcement action. But those questions are still remain to be seen. So at this stage, we're at the point where we've started to vet these options. We've had a couple of stakeholder meetings and regulatory advisory group meetings in June and September to talk through the pros and cons of each of these options, and we're at the point now where we need to make some decisions and get down a path so we can start in the rulemaking process. So I just wanted to mention some of the things we're trying to balance as we're evaluating these options, and you've already heard me touch on some of these things. The first one, of course, being the regional flexibility versus statewide consistency. Some of the regional boards really want us to say, thou shalt do this, and really have a lot of direction from the state board. Other regions, of course, have a different perspective and would like a lot more flexibility. So we're trying to balance that out. I couldn't think of another term, so I just said we got to bite off what we can chew in a statewide policy. You know, we need to be able to put something in place, put something on the books, get tools in place that people are starting to use. I always liken it to toxicity testing back in the 1980s when we started putting toxicity monitoring requirements and permits, and at that point it just said do a bioassay, and if you've got toxicity, do a TIE. Well, since then we've become a lot more sophisticated, and the folks that had to implement those requirements had an incentive to help us develop the technology and the tools, and so to this now we're in the process of actually revising how the tools are used, and there's a lot more tools and technology available for identifying the causes of toxicity. So we're at the stage where we need to just start getting to use the tools and get others to help us develop the technology, particularly in the respect of the causal assessment work. And then we also need to evaluate the costs of implementing such a policy and what the implications are there. And there's actually some good news along those lines in that my board actually put into a recent resolution that we would utilize a standardized checklist as a pilot in this policy development effort. And so not only did we get their attention at the science workshop back in September, but they actually mentioned this policy in a resolution. So it's almost like we got sued and we can actually use that as a way to get over the finish line. Almost. So what are our next steps? As I mentioned, we're going to need to select a preferred policy option, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to do that in the next couple of months. And from there, draft the policy language for further management review and stakeholder review. I'll be working with stakeholders along the way and helping vet the language we put together. We'll also need to prepare a staff report that supports the policy and justifies it. And as I mentioned, prepare an economic analysis per the cost of compliance resolution recently adopted by our board. We need to prepare the documents and questions for external peer review. So you guys heard a lot about our science committee and all that they did to weigh in and help guide us in the technical aspects of the policy development. Well, we'll have to now go through an additional external peer review to justify what the science behind the policy that we're putting in place. And then while the stakeholders have had 3 years of apples to bite and will continue to have more bites at the apple before we have a final draft, they will get an additional bite at the apple when we go through the rulemaking. And then finally, we'll hope to have board workshop and adoption hearings within the next maybe year to 18 months, depending on how this goes. And I seem to keep saying that. I think I said last year my hope was that I'd have a draft policy by right now, which I don't. So hopefully next year I'll be able to invite you all to an adoption hearing not long after the meeting. We'll see. But with that, I'm going to end my dry presentation and open it up for questions.
I assume you'd be entertaining a combination of options, perhaps?
Yeah, thank you, John. Those options are really not exclusive of each other, and yeah, we may have a smattering of pieces of each of those fit in.
Yeah, I just was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the what you see as the challenges for implementing tiered aquatic life uses.
Wow, that's a whole workshop all by itself, isn't it?
You could be real brief.
Well, I think the big challenge is that we have not actually evaluated and done a really thorough job of defining what our aquatic life beneficial uses are and how bugs could be used. You know, what does it mean for warm and cold aquatic life uses in terms of the bugs? And how does that then relate to the fish? And so I think there's a huge amount of science that we need to do in order to define that. And certainly on a statewide basis, it's even more complicated. So we should have a workshop on that. Tiered aquatic life use. That'd be fun. Right here.
First of all, I think trying to standardize all the regions into one umbrella is an awesome idea. It helps, will definitely help, especially when you consider, how diverse California is with the various habitats and everything. But what I'm curious about with your quote, let's say a good stream, how will you figure out, is there a way to differentiate between a first order and fourth order stream, and whether it's the Smith River versus the Mojave River. When you're looking at all those things, is that all structured in there?
Yeah.
Because obviously an 85 in one stream is definitely not a .85, you know. So I'm
It
just looking
actually is in our model.
It is.
And it
Okay, that would
is.
be
And I'm
fascinating.
going to let Pete nod as I'm saying the correct thing and go like this if I'm saying the wrong thing. But yes, our model captures site-specific reference, basically. For each site, there's a pool of streams that have similar geology, similar evolution. Didn't you? Anyway. Similar precipitation, all of the things that are sort of the natural variability at a site, the reference pool that it's compared to have those same characteristics. And so a 0.85 in the North Coast region in a first order stream means the same thing as a 0.85 down in the Southern California Stormwater Monitoring Coalition area. Yeah. I wasn't watching Pete as I was talking, so did I get any of those?
Well, the follow-up to that is, so what is the starting point of good? Meaning, I mean, we are stuck with things like the LA River. We are going to have concrete lined streams. So do we establish a quote good as of now, or?
Yeah, so that's the whole thing I was talking about, modified streams. And we absolutely, well, we can't put a policy in place where we know it's not an achievable policy, right? And so that's why we recognize that for modified streams, we're going to have some alternative measures. The challenge, of course, is defining what that population of streams are and defining what good biology is for those types of streams.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.